Welcome to episode 2 of my Colonizing Minmus series, in which I, an average Kerbal Space Program player, attempt a colonization program in a new science save. The first video was just the preliminary missions to unlock the bare minimum of the tech tree to even reach Minmus. Since the first few missions are almost identical for all players, I didn't provide any commentary for that video as there wasn't much unique to my playthrough to talk about. In this video, we will be undertaking the initial missions to Minmus itself. The first flight will be an orbital survey and a dress rehearsal of the landing, similar to how Apollo 10 was a dress rehearsal for Apollo 11. The second flight will consist of multiple landings on Minmus, with the dual goals of both gaining science from different biomes while also surveying potential sites for the colony to be established. At this point, the lander itself is completed. It's fairly similar to most people's first Minmus landers, using the Terrier engine and all the science gear currently unlocked. It's a little bit different though, as I'm using the Gemini capsule carrying 2 Kerbals, not the Mercury capsule which only contains 1. This way, I can bring both a pilot and a scientist. The pilot to maintain control of the SAS systems even when not in communication with the KSC, and a scientist to be able to restore and reuse the 2 science experiments which otherwise could only be used once. It seems obvious, but I'm only an average player, as you will see demonstrated by my not great piloting, with the rocket wobbling around as I try to complete the gravity turn. For any newer players who haven't reached other celestial bodies yet, I find it easiest to reach Minmus by plotting the maneuver node on the ascending or descending nodes. This is where your trajectory is the line from where your orbital plane and Minmus's orbital planes intersect, meaning there are minimal inclination changes that need to be made. Even so, I do make further inclination changes after getting further away from Kerbin to reach a mostly equatorial orbit of Minmus. These 2 maneuvers could be done in a single burn, but I find it easier to first get the Minmus encounter and then change the inclination to reach the desired trajectory. In my imagination for this series, this mission's goal is to survey the surface of Minmus from orbit, to identify different biomes and potential landing sites for the future mission. This is similar to how NASA sent both probes and the first manned missions to the Moon to identify potential landing sites of interest, both for scientific purposes and for the feasibility of landing at a given location. Overdid the Minmus escape burn. My burn was too long, so that my orbital direction relative to Kerbal reversed. Instead of orbiting in an eastward direction, the same direction as the planet's rotation, I ended up going westward, meaning I had additional velocity when arriving back at Kerbal that needed to be burned off before being able to safely land. I also ended up with my perigee too high up in the atmosphere. Rather than returning to the surface, I skipped back out of the atmosphere and ended up needing to make a few more orbits before the atmospheric drag slowed me down enough to land. That's somewhat unusual when compared with most KSP players on my landing is that I don't end up ditching the empty fuel tanks and engine. Rather than using the heat shield, I tried, was successful, returning the lander itself to the surface. In my imagination, this is so the Kerbal Air and Space Museum can have the full vehicle to display, rather than only the capsule. In the real world, the only part of Apollo 11 in the Smithsonian is the capsule itself. The lunar lander components were left on the Moon or crashed back into the Moon after being used, while the service module burned up in Earth's atmosphere. I wanted the Kerbal museums to have the full lander from the first mission to Minmus. The orbital mission is completed. The launch vehicle needs to be modified so it has enough Delta V to conduct multiple landings across various biomes on Minmus. To do this, I got rid of the single SRB and replaced it with a vectorable liquid fuel engine, as well as two side-mounted SRBs. decided to alter the crew for the second mission. Bob, as the scientist, still needs to go to be able to reuse the science equipment, but since both Jeb and Valentina are pilots, I decided to give Valentina a chance to fly. From the real-world perspective, as most, if not all, launches don't have the same person fly on two sequential missions. Launching using SRBs that have a very high thrust-to-weight ratio is to have a much shallower gravity turn. Since the SRBs cannot be throttled, I use them to get through the thicker parts of the atmosphere sooner, so that less of their force is then wasted fighting drag. Given that landing in one biome, running all the science experiments, collecting the data, restoring the mystery goo and science junior units, collecting surface samples and observations, and then setting up a flag almost looked the exact same as doing them in another biome, I chose to mostly speed up the subsequent landings to 8 times normal speed in post-production, to make the video a little shorter and hopefully less repetitive. To make it clearer what's going on, I landed in the highlands, midlands, lowlands, great flats, flats, and poles. I also identified surface features that could be scanned with the rover arms for future exploration, once the colony is established, by marking them with flags. was much better than the first one. I didn't skip off the atmosphere, and I still managed to save the full lander for a Kerbal museum. Thank you for watching my video. In the next episode, I anticipate creating a communications satellite network and possibly a space station around Minmus, so the eventual colony site will be able to constantly remain in contact with Kerbin.